The gospel that is chosen for today comes the Gospel of John. And a couple things in that gospel lesson stood out for me. Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up again. It's easy to remember that Jesus is standing in the midst of a building, a beautiful temple that has been 46 years in the construction and is not done yet. So he says, I'll destroy it and I'll build it in 3 days. I'm sure those first listeners and there in that audience looked around at that building. Many of them might have been involved in building that building. They might have remembered the hard work and the days and maybe the hot weather in that climate, or the storms that were coming their way when they were working to put stones in place and build a wall or put the window in. So they sort of laughed. The other part of our text, and part of it that I really loved and resonated to, was John towards the end just says, the disciples, about 3 years later, the disciples suddenly realized, oh, this is what he meant. I don't know if you've ever had those moments. I love sermon notes, one of my favorite things. And I remember about 3 weeks ago, one of the notes just said, oh, now I understand that verse and what you meant by this. Of course, I read the next one, and it said, well, I always understood that part, but today I learned this. I think that's part of our Lenten discipline. We come back to the text, we come back to that faith, and sometimes we just don't see the obvious. We think we understand, but then we come back and refocus and realize, oh, that's not quite what I remembered, or I have a new understanding. And somebody shared that with me. So I'm often fond in those same set of sermon notes. And I'm sure they and probably parents and half people don't believe this, but I always tell the confirmants that I learn from your sermon notes. I go back and learn from their insights. Sometimes they're lessons that I've never thought of. But I look back and go, well, that's true. And sometimes I look back and I need to be reminded of that truth. It enriches and rebuilds my own faith. Let's read a couple commentaries, one of whom talked about the problem with the whips. Most people don't like the whips. Jesus gets the whips and he takes them out and he cleans the place up. And it's a violent scene and it's a scene of anger. And for many people that just doesn't fit. But it is there in our text. But I love one devotional writer this week, Brian Stoppenhagen, wrote, this is why the whips gives us so much trouble, is we do understand why he had to do that. And our fear is, especially in the midst of Lent, especially in a time when we sit down to refocus ourselves, our fear is that we are no better than those business people in that first temple. And we need to clean it up. I love this one phrase. You sit there, can you picture the group goes in and the temple just stink? There's all those animals, all that debris, all those people. It was ugly, it was smelly, and all that business had nothing to do with what was really going on, the worship of God. In fact, it got in the way. And the proof, well, the proof is in the people of God. And there they were, and how offended they were by Jesus. And so he said, maybe that's why you and I are offended by those whips, because we fear that Jesus is going to come in and really going to clear up our lives. It's a part of our Lenten discipline. Let's take time to reflect on ourselves and what God is doing and what God is up to. He's sitting in that building, and he's looking around the temple. And they are proud of what they built. And remember the craftsmanship. It's not like they could bring in cranes. Any stones had to be moved by physical labor by hand. They had to be placed. They had to be polished. Everything had to be done by hard work. Any wonder that for 46 years the people who've been a part of that were just proud of what they'd done. But they lost their focus of what it was all about. And sometimes I think we do that. We go through our Lenten disciplines, we go through our yearly worship, and we show up on Sunday morning. Or another phrase that's a favorite of mine, we show up to worship the vending machine God. If we go to 9 o'clock service and 10:30, we expect more blessings. And if we show up on Wednesday as well as Sunday morning, and we might be involved in something else, then we expect God's going to bless us even more. And we sort of lose track. It's like we just keep feeding the vending machine, or we're bargaining with God and just saying, this is going to be about. And they'll say they had there sit there and they built a beautiful place for worship. It could be seen from miles away by friends and enemies how much they love their God and how much He is a part of it. But Jesus comes in and realizes nobody's focused on the Father. Other things have gotten in the way. They've cluttered it up. And the disciples 3 years later look back and say, He wasn't talking about tearing down the physical walls. He was talking about our life. He wasn't talking about the corruption and all the dirt and the smell of what was going on in the temple from the animals that day. He was talking about the dirts and smells that are in our life, of what sin does to our heart, or all the things that would distract us from following our God and hearing God, what God offers to us. I think for us in our Lenten thing, our Lenten discipline, our journey right now, we might begin to say, it's springtime and it's time for spring cleaning. I'm pretty excited this week. The minus temperatures are gone and the warm weather comes out. How much we are tempted to celebrate that. Except, I realize the snow covers up a lot of dirt and a lot of mess. And in just a few days, it's going to be readily apparent. I think that's what this gospel can do for us in our faith journey. Those whips and those actions of Jesus ask us to expose ourselves and open up to God, that we might truly worship and follow God and seek Him out in our life. And maybe like the disciples, to look back on a familiar lesson and a familiar event in Jesus' life and say, this is what Jesus is asking of me. It wasn't about the beautiful temple on the mount. It wasn't about the corruption or the animals. It was about God and me. I think to that end, this gospel offers us a great deal in our Lenten journey, and something to think about both today, and I hope in the coming week you'll take time to reflect back on this short passage. I want to turn to the Gospel of John from the 2nd chapter. John writes, "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, He found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, He drove them all out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, 'Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace.' His disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.' The Jews then said to Him, 'What sign can you show us for doing this?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' Then the Jews then said, 'The temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?' But He was speaking of the temple of His body. After He was raised from the dead, His disciples remembered that He had said this, and they believed the Scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. And so I think that Jesus has that same zeal for his Father's house and temple as the temple you call your body and you call your life. We share in the bread and wine of communion. As we share in communion this morning, is receive that body and blood of Christ. Receive that forgiveness, that grace, and that powerful living. And know how much God cares for you and for the love that you share in the world.